Half a day and welcome. I'm Kimberly of Humanities Guåhan, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon as we launch Unincorporated, Voting, Voices, and Visions para Guåhan, a 5-part webinar series and digital magazine exploring CHamoru stories, experiences, and perspectives in relation to voting rights, democracy, decolonization, self-determination, and Guam's political status. Humanities Guåhan received a grant of more than $40,000 from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in partnership with the Federation of State Humanities Councils to produce this program as part of a nationwide initiative, Why It Matters, Civic and Electoral Participation. We see ourselves as the convener, connector, and catalyst for this program as we explore why civic engagement matters through an exploration of the political history of Guam and the histories, experiences, and diverse perspectives of the island's indigenous people. Humanities Guåhan is humbled and honored by the opportunity to bring this important project to our island community. Today, we bring you the inaugural webinar in our series, Måmakpo, CHamoru Self-Determination, featuring celebrated historian and scholar, Dr. Robert Underwood, in conversation with community advocate and poet, Selina Onedera-Salas. I'll now introduce Selina, who will in turn introduce Dr. Underwood. I've been privileged to know Selina for the past 15 years as a previous Humanities Guåhan board member, our current Grant Review Committee chairwoman, as a colleague and a friend. Selina is a legislative policy analyst and community advocate, currently working with the office of Senator Clinton Rigel. She's actively involved in community nonprofit organizations that seek to protect, perpetuate, and promote the preservation of CHamoru cultural values. Selina earned a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Texas at San Antonio and immediately returned home to continue her career in public service. Selina also chaired the Literary Arts Committee for the 2016 Festival of Pacific Arts held in Guåhan. Thank you so much, Selina, for your partnership in presenting Unincorporated, and a sincere thank you to Dr. Underwood for giving the inaugural project presentation. Siu Smasi. Selina?
Hafaday Zansizu Usmaasi Kim. Hafaday to our participants and panelists for today's webinar. It is my honor to be facilitating this webinar with Dr. Underwood. Before I begin, I do want to share a little bit about our thoughts of the title, Måmakpo. And Dr. Underwood and I and the group decided that this would be an appropriate title for the presentation in the sense that CHamoru Self-Determination is a plight that has been long fought for, and many people have gone far and wide to share our story of struggle with the rest of the world. And even despite the recent decision by the Supreme Court and the Davis case, we feel that this has not ended. We are not finished. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the title for today's webinar. Some housekeeping rules to get this part out of the way. There is, for those of you who are participating through the Zoom call, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen for you to present your questions. Throughout the presentation, Dr. Underwood we've broken this down into segments. And so after each segment, we will have the opportunity to present questions for him to answer for the group. And I'd also like to ask that you please keep your questions related to the presentation section. So now for the fun part. It is my distinct honor and privilege to present our speaker for today's conversation, the Honorable Dr. Robert Underwood. He is an historian and scholar who has served the people of Guam in many capacities as an educator, a writer, a featured columnist, a respected representative of Guam who served as our delegate for 5 terms in the US House of Representatives. And more recently, he served as president of the University of Guam until he retired in 2018. Dr. Underwood has also spent much of his personal life and time in pursuit of CHamoru Self-Determination. For decades, he has been directly involved with grassroots movements in the quest for CHamoru self-determination, and his work has inspired generations to continue the discussion and the effort for our people to achieve decolonization. I am pleased to have this time and conversation with Dr. Robert Underwood. Siduus maasi pareitem pomupagu nahaani senyot itareha mupagu.
Okay, thank you very much, Sidus Masi Selina. Buenas tardes todos hamzu. I appreciate this opportunity presented by Guåhan Humanities. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I was on the original Humanities board, as was Narissa, who's also, I noticed, on the call. As some of you know, maybe not all of you know, I'm in an undisclosed location because I'm under quarantine. I just got back on island on Wednesday. So this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about CHamoru self-determination, provide some background, some historical background, and how it was originally conceptualized, historically conceptualized, as we call it now, in the 1970s, and then subsequent to various political developments, the government of Guam has defined it by statute, and basically we're guided by that. And it's also its connection to basically US law and its connection to United Nations conventions or United Nations principles, which is also an important feature of this. And then lastly, to talk about the challenge of the exercise of CHamoru self-determination and its future and how I think it should proceed. And also to clarify in that process a distinction between incremental political progress, which is highly celebrated, and the other part, which is more fundamental, which is actual self-determination or making a case for political status change. Next slide. So here we have the, next slide, there. Now we have the Tautotano. So very good looking people connected to the ocean. And as you can see, they're mostly naked. But the issue here is that we have to kind of understand where this comes from, where this issue comes from. And of course, it doesn't intellectually come from them, but it actually comes from their experience. And so for some 3,500 years, there have been people living in the Marianas Islands. There's some conversation as to whether a place in Saipan, Unay, Baput, or whether Letegtan, Retidian was the first settled in the Marianas, but it's certainly 3,500 to maybe 4,000 years ago. Next slide. And so in this next slide, we see the Chamorro people, actually Tautotano people, they weren't really called Chamorros until the 19th century in a popular way. And these people, this is reflective of the caste structure and in a highly idealized form. Of course, everybody is healthy and well-constructed. So that's what we like to think of as the origins of the Tautotano. Next slide. So the question here is, you have the Tautotano, which are the ancient Chamorros, the progenitors of the Chamorro people today. Then you have the Spanish conquest, and then you have the emergence of the what we commonly call now the Chamorro people, who are actually, successors to the Tautotano. And then the colonial rule actually sort of acknowledge the good thing about colonial rule is it told you who was being ruled and who was ruler, and how that kind of interrupted the process. And it wasn't self-determination was interrupted or taken away. Actually, sovereignty was taken away. Not a nation state, not a nation as we normally think of it, but the idea that the people who lived here, the Tautotano, had sovereignty over their lives. That was taken away. That's what the essence of conquest meant, that there was a new set of authority. And the next slide, please. And the right of conquest, of course, was exercised by initially by Spain. It was determined by Legazpi Visit, who in the 1560s, who claimed the Marianas and Guam for Spain and exercised its authority just by fiat, by self-proclamation. And it was actually exercised and came to fruition as a result of the missionary Padre Diego de Salvatore. And it's important to note that the conquest was then consummated by the presence of the missionary. It wasn't, sometimes people present these issues as if there was some kind of cultural misunderstanding and everything was going along until they had some kind of cultural misunderstanding and then all hell broke loose and that's what caused the problem. Actually, the source of this problem is the idea that there's a right of conquest. That's the source of the issue. So of course, the motivation of the missionary, Salvatore, was the conversion of the people and the Chamorro people, the Tautotano, and that was seen as legitimate by their own guidelines. But of course, that was illegitimate and not really fully recognized by the Tautotano until they started noticing the exercise of authority, the depopulation because of the onset of diseases, and of course, the actual battles that were fought between the Spaniards and the Tautotano, the Chamorro people. Next slide. So the Chamorro people then emerged out of this, what we commonly called originally after the period of depopulation into the 18th century, the 1700s. Sometimes the people were called Marianos because they were from the Mariana Islands, but most often just called basically Indios or natives. And eventually in the 1800s, as a result of a census conducted and the fact that the native inhabitants, the Indios, were relieved of tax obligations. So even mestizos, so-called mestizos, wanted to be Indios, and that became sort of the birth of the Chamorro people. So still going back, and you can see the emergence of that. I think there were, obviously, we're talking about a time period that was rich in history. You see a woman there making, using a metate from Mesoamerica, from Mexico, and making corn. You see that they're now smoking, which of course they didn't used to do. And you can also see that they're probably going bare-breasted, around certainly around the home into the 1800s, and then after that they didn't go bare-breasted. I don't think they went bare-breasted in town, but that was the emergence of this group of people that had a kind of an identity of who they were, that they were the Indios, they were the natives of the people of the Marianas, even though there was a lot of mixture between Spaniards and Filipinos. They still saw themselves as the native inheritors of what was the Marianas Islands. Next slide. So the Treaty of Paris in 1898, as a result of the Spanish-American War, then essentially transferred this right of conquest to the United States. So the right of conquest in this is really important to understand, because sometimes we fail to appreciate that the right of conquest meant certain obligations, but it also meant a certain responsibility and a certain acknowledgement that you had taken away something from people. This was not a treaty arrangement. This was not a treaty arrangement with the local people. This was not an agreement. The local people didn't petition for this. They didn't ask to be part of the American Empire. They didn't ask to be part of the Spanish Empire, but simply an exercise of the right of conquest. And the Treaty of Paris and basically transferred that original right of conquest, which Spain had, over to the United States in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. And certain things came out of that act, which have affected the political and social and cultural lives of the island of Guam, indeed the whole Marianas till today. The Treaty of Paris acknowledged that there were native inhabitants' civil and political rights had to be dealt with by the US government. So that was the first time that there was acknowledgement that there were these people and something had to be done with them. And then they had civil and political rights. And so there was a responsibility inherent in it. You just didn't say, I'm taking over and I don't have to listen to anything. I have to do something about the native inhabitants' civil and political rights. And so this, of course, the Philippines and Puerto Rico came to the United States under the same treaty. But unlike the Philippines and Puerto Rico, there were active movements for autonomy and independence in the case of the Philippines. So the Philippines suffered the kind of double whammy of not only being originally conquered by the US, but in terms of declaring their own independence, they were then subsequently conquered by the United States and then handed over, their sovereignty was handed over. What to do with these new territories is actually the basis for the title of this series. That is through a series of insular cases held by the Supreme Court, Downs versus Bidwell, you had the creation of a category called unincorporated territory. No such distinction exists in statute, and no such distinction exists in the Constitution of the United States. It existed in the framing of this by the Supreme Court. The same Supreme Court, always and constitutional scholars know this, the same Supreme Court that ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that you could have separate but equal. So in a way, you have separate kinds of territories through this, whereas before, all the territories that were acquired by the US through the Louisiana Purchase, through the cession, through Conquest in the Mexican War, through even the acceptance of the state of Hawaii and the purchase of Alaska, those territories were presumed to be on a track to statehood. So they had to create, because these were new territories. Oh my gosh, Puerto Ricans, who are they? Filipinos, lots of Filipinos, who are they? And then of course the native inhabitants of Guam. So there was a lot of racial characterizations that these people were not yet ready to even be considered a full territory or any path to statehood, because their traditions and were so radically different than the Anglo-Saxon basis for American rule of law and American culture and American civilization. So that meant that these people were not going to be incorporated. They were they were owned by the United States, but they were not part of the United States. That's the meaning of unincorporated. And so that was done through a series of court decisions, mostly involving customs duties about things that were being brought in from Puerto Rico. That was the origin of it. And so through that, it meant that these people were not US citizens. So they weren't citizens. They weren't part of the United States. They were owned by the United States. They were, in the words of the insular cases, foreign in a domestic sense. That's the whole genesis of where we stand today. So in order to continue to manage affairs, then the naval government was created through presidential executive order, and the President McKinley gave the governance of the island of Guam over to the US Navy, and there it stayed until the US Congress saw fit to pass a law in 1950 to create the Organic Act of Guam. About a few months before the Organic Act of Guam, President Truman did exercise his executive authority to transfer the management of Guam away from the Department of the Navy and turned it over to the Department of Interior, and then in full anticipation of the creation of the Organic Act. And so the next slide will be a view of the Treaty of Paris. There they are. There's all the people surrounding the, they're not part of the, they're not part of the creation. They're not part of the management. They're not part of the request. They're not part of the action. They're simply being transferred from one country to another in terms of the Treaty of Paris. And this stayed until World War II. So you had 1898 and you had the given Guam and you had the Declaration of Unincorporated Territory, and this stayed until World War II. And then World War II created a whole series of other events, and that's the next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Underwood. We'll now close this off as our first segment, and I wanted to open up the opportunity for questions and answers. And we do have a question that just came in, Dr. Underwood. The question is, there has been much talk of tribal status or tribal recognition among my peers recently. In your opinion, do you believe moving in that direction to be a hindrance to CHamoru self-determination or a benefit?
Well, that's not pertinent to this part of the, but I don't think tribal status is part of CHamoru self-determination. The tribal status belongs to the native inhabitants of the US when the US was created. And so that tribal status, it's mentioned in the US Constitution. Those apply to the Aboriginal groups of the United States as it existed at the time. In order to apply those to Guam, then the people of Guam would have to kind of incorporate as a tribe and then petition the federal government to acquire tribal status. So, you know, there's already a lot of other tribes. I just see it as kind of a difficult political process to navigate. But in any case, the way we get out of this is we get out of unincorporated territory status. We don't get out of it by all of a sudden proclaiming some different situation all along. And sometimes the terms get a little confusing because we use the terms indigenous, and then we use the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and we sort of assume that, you know, all indigenous peoples are the same, or they all have the same history. They don't all have the same history, and they have a different relationship to the government which instituted them. And in this case, the origin of Guam's relationship to the United States is the right of conquest. And that right of conquest took sovereignty away from the people of Guam. And so in order to get out of it, you have to sort of give it back to them for, you know, at least half hour until they decide what they want to do. That's really the basis for, that's the basis for this. That's the basis for CHamoru Self-Determination.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about the right of conquest, but in going over the previous slide, you discussed a little bit about the acknowledgement of Native and inhabitants' civil and political rights, but what happened to the right of self-determination? Wasn't there a question? Or?
Yeah, so, well, it's a fair question, but it's like you know, at the time that the Spanish governed or forcibly took Guam and proclaimed the right of conquest, there was no such thing as sort of recognizing what to do with these people. They had a thing in the Council of Indies inside the Spanish government, but that was like how to treat them fair.
Dr. Underwood, did we lose the connection?
As a political concept, didn't really emerge until World War I. When coming out of World War I, they had to do something with all these small national groups inside Europe. So Woodrow Wilson created this notion of self-determination, that the United States was fighting for the self-determination. Well, not the self-determination of the people of Guam, but for the self-determination of these national groups inside Europe. Then at the end of World War II, the concept of self-determination was sort of incorporated into the United Nations Charter, and then came full blossom into the UN Declaration, UN Resolution 1541, which is the resolution that created the system of non-self-governing territories in the UN today.
Malik, thank you. We do have a question from the audience. I don't know if you want to address this now or later through the presentation, but the question is, what is the difference between the terms territory and colony?
There's no difference. You know, colony presumes, you know, colonies had, the word colony has had a good and bad press all. Now a little bit more legal concept, because I don't think there's you can't go to court and say we're a colony and where do you find the word colony in the law? But you do find territory. And so territory and the unincorporated territory and the incorporated territory are defined legal concepts in American jurisprudence. So territory has a real meaning.
Thank you. I have, let's see. Here we go. Here's another question. Are the CHamoru and the Tautautano one and the same people?
Well, historically, they are one and the same people, but they've gone through a lot of changes. So obviously, I introduced the word CHamoru because the word CHamoru was not used at the time of the Tautautano. It wasn't really widely used until the 1800s, until the 19th century. And so it's continued to today. And so, you know, sometimes for a period of time, Guamanian was used as a kind of a modernized word for CHamoru. And then now Guamanian has gone off in an entirely different direction. So now everyone is a Guamanian. So basically, CHamoru refers to the natives, and that was how it was used in the 1800s. And the Tautotano are basically that's a kind of a CHamoru concept. You have people who are of the land and people who are not of the land. You have Tautohaja, people from the inland, and Tautolago, people from the outside. So that's basically.
Just one other question to add to that. Were the Tautotano different from that presumably older people? I guess.
Well, of course, 3,500 years of history. They're not this. It's going to be, I mean, the problem is that people think in static terms. Even before the Europeans came here, there were lots of changes. There was either the creation of the lattice stone, and that created enormous changes in CHamoru society. So the idea that there was this kind of like static society and then nothing happened until the Europeans showed up, and then the Spaniards came and there was this conflagration, and then nothing happened, and until the Americans showed up, and nothing happened until the Japanese showed up, is a denial of the passage of time, and the people here were doing different things. So yeah, obviously they weren't exactly the same people, but if you ask me the question, could I have a conversation in CHamoru with Matapang, who's over here? He's over here somewhere. Yeah, he's back here. I'm at the Dusatani. He's over here next to the reef. If I have a conversation with Matapang or Hurao, in CHamoru, yes, I could. It'll be a little difficult and a little stilted, but it'll still work. So yeah, I feel like we're the same people. I sometimes make I said, that's just like, Elton John or Mick Jagger having a conversation with William Shakespeare. Of course, they're not speaking English the same way. And of course, they'll have a little bit of, going back and forth at each other, but it's still English. And it's still CHamoru.
Malik, and perfect timing for that kind of discussion with the recent release of the orthography too. So thank you very much. We'll go ahead and move on to your next segment of your presentation.
Okay, so on the next slide, we have coming out of World War II. There we go. So you had the Japanese occupation, and the people of Guam, of course, the CHamoru people underwent a lot of stress, and there were a lot of changes, dramatic changes that came out of World War II. Not just the war itself, but the fact that you had a huge military presence. You had lots of land moving around, and people felt that their land was taken away, and you had issues coming out of World War II. And who are we? What is our future like? So most of the time, people thought that we would get better treatment if we were US citizens. So the quest for US citizenship was ramped up. And you had the primary leaders of that were F.B. Leon Guerrero and Antonio Wampat. And that quest for citizenship meant that they felt that would be like the next stage. So if people of Guam were US citizens, then the military couldn't treat them so badly in terms of land and economic policies. It's important to note that there was a lot of economic activity going on. There was a lot of discrimination in wage structures. There was a lot of expropriation of land under very strange circumstances. All of this was going on. So while people were relieved that the war was over and they were no longer experiencing the Japanese occupation, there was enormous change, and they weren't part of that. They weren't part of managing that. That was managed primarily by people in uniform from the Navy. So the quest for citizenship was revived in earnest. It had a little bit of pre-World War II action, but was revived in earnest. And there was a new international climate coming out of World War II. And there were also some people in Washington, DC and the US who were friends of this citizenship movement. Laura Thompson, or Harold Ickes, John Collier, I think it was Laura Thompson's husband, and a whole group of people. They started an organization. And so in combination, you started to feel a sense of movement and change. And at the same time, you had the United Nations, according to Article 73 of the United Nations, they created this non-self-governing territory list. What were you going to do with areas that were not fully self-governing? So the UN said, we're going to create an article for them. And that's Article 73. On the basis of that article, the United States voluntarily, along with the United Kingdom and along with France, they voluntarily put their non-self-governing territories on a list. And then they annually reported on them starting from 1946 and what their progress was going to be. That there was going to be this full commitment to political self-development. Not quite, the term self-determination was not quite yet used until the 60s, but advancement, political development, monitoring, all of these things were kind of implied by this process. And I always point out that, the UN Charter is a treaty, and treaty is treated as law in US jurisprudence. So it's not something that you can just say, well, we don't have to listen to it. No, you do have to listen to it. People can take you to court over this because these things are kind of legal obligations. So all of that movement then created the Organic Act. So the Organic Act, the main provision of the Organic Act was to create US citizenship for the people of Guam. So how do you determine who are the people of Guam? Well, the Congress, this Congressional Act determined who the people of Guam were. And basically they recognized the Chamorro people two different ways. One is they said that people of Guamanian ancestry, and everybody in 1950 knew who were Guamanians, unlike today. Everyone's confused today, but in 1950 it was pretty clear who were Guamanians. And people of Guamanian ancestry should have preference in hiring in the government of Guam. So there was clear legal provision for that. That's an act that the US Congress could affirmatively discriminate on behalf of an ethnic group simply by passing a law, because Guam was an unincorporated territory, and Congress can decide what to apply to Guam and what not to apply to Guam. So that's a very important provision. And then secondly, determining who were going to be citizens. It said if it was meant for Guamanians, and if you weren't clear who you were, you had to have ancestry in Guam going back to 1898, going back to before the Treaty of Paris. So it was pretty clear who the Organic Act was written for. So that's why when we hear the concept, how do we determine who is Chamorro self-determination? We say use the Organic Act definition, because the Organic Act is federal law, is a US law passed by Congress that helped determine who the Chamorro people were. Although in this instance, they called them Guamanians. Okay, next slide. So there you have Article 73, and it says that they're members of the UN, which have or assume responsibility for the administration of territories whose people have not yet attained a full measure of self-government, like Guam, recognize the principle that the interests of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount, and accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within the system of international peace and security established by the present charter the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories and to this end. So you see that the obligations are starting to pick up. You had their recognition in the Treaty of Paris, and then you have this obligation. So that's why Guam was put on the non-self-governing list of territories. And just as an historical aside, coming out of World War II, as I said before, the right of conquest, the abrogation of the right of conquest was the basis for most of the war crime trials, which was aggression. So the winners of World War II created the war crime trials. And so you had two classes, you had lots of classes of crimes. One were crimes against humanity, like genocide and cannibalism and punishing people unnecessarily and killing them. And then you also had wars of aggression. And so the UN Charter forever ended the notion that you had right of conquest. And of course, the winners of World War II were the ones who put this into practice through the UN Charter and through international law, although ironically, they were amongst the greatest practitioners of the right of conquest in the past. So both the United Kingdom and France and the United States helped kind of put this system together, even the Soviet Union, and they were the greatest practitioners of the right of conquest in the past. But the way they were seeing it is that was what Japan and Germany and Italy were trying to do, and we're putting an end to that. And we're taking the territories that they had and we're creating trust territories. So all the territories of the losing parties of World War II went into the trust territory system. The territories of the winning team in World War II went to the Article 73 bin. So that's the distinction between the two. So that's why the Micronesia and the TTPI went in another bin and Guam went into this bin. Okay, next slide. And there we have Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, signing another act in which Guam is on the table again. Only this time we have at least one guy from Guam watching. I don't know if he was a participant, but there he is. He's Uncle Carlos Taitano was at least there, unlike in the Treaty of Paris, where there's no Guamanians or Chamorros or Tautotano. So this is the Organic Act, which was seen as a very progressive act at the time. I don't want to, it's been demeaned a lot, but was seen as a very progressive act. And President Truman, ironically, just like President Johnson, were both individuals who became well known for racially progressive policies in American history, even though their personal backgrounds were not in that way. So Harry Truman desegregated the military, and he also wanted to make sure that territories were not managed by Department of Defense. Next slide. So then now what happens after the Organic Act is you have a series of incremental progress, political development. In the 1960s, President LBJ, they created all these federal programs that we're now beneficiaries of, like Medicare, Medicaid, a whole bunch of programs that the federal government expanded dramatically. So Guam became a participant in those programs. Then you had the elective governorship in 1970. And then what they did is in exchange for giving the people of Guam the right to have elective governorship, they eliminated the provision on giving preference in GovGuam employment to persons of Guamanian ancestry. And then they applied the 15th Amendment, which is the amendment that Dave Davis used in his lawsuit, which is referring to voting rights. So that's what happened in creating the elective governorship. Then the elected delegate was created in 1972. Of course, Congressman Wampat was the first elected delegate. There was increased reliance on federal funding and participation as a determination of progress. All elected officials in Guam said, you elect me to office, I'll go and I'll get you more money. I'll get you more money from the feds. And that was seen as like, and it's still the same. The more money we get from the feds, it's the more successful as an elected official I am, because that was seen as the determination of progress. And in explaining why the people of Guam should get more money from the federal government than they currently get, there was always used the justification for loyalty in World War II. Mr. Wampat was particularly adept at this. Every time there was some new funding program for Guam, he would point out that the people of Guam suffered for America in World War II. And there was Guam's strategic value, of course, and then participation in the Korean, Vietnam Wars. And then I don't know what that subs refers to there. I should clean up that part of the PowerPoint. But so strategic value and participation in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. So the justification as for loyalty in World War II, people of Guam were very proud of their role in World War II and used it to great effect to say the people of Guam are special because their loyalty to the United States was tested in ways that no one else was tested. And they came through in flying colors. And that's why we deserve more money, more freedom. And it became kind of part of the cornerstone of political philosophy. And of course, a lot of it depended on your attitude too. You know, I remember Governor Ricky Bordallo coming back from a trip to Washington, DC one time. This was one of the greatest lines I've ever heard. A reporter asked, because Governor Bordallo typically went into, I went to Washington, I got this funding. Everybody has to get funding when they go to Washington. They come back, they have to report that they got something. So everybody, I got this. And a reporter asked him, says, Governor Bordallo, when you go to Washington, aren't you tired of begging for more money? He looked at him, he said, when I go to Washington, I don't beg, I go collecting. So it's your attitude. So he was a collector, maybe the others were beggars, who knows? But this is so different than the next slide. Next slide, please. So now you have, well, you're now going to change your political status. All of a sudden, the Micronesians who were disloyal or not, or seen as sort of on the Japanese side in World War II, because they were part of the Japanese mandate, especially the people in the Northern Marianas, and they were getting high-level attention. These Washington, D.C. officials would come to Guam, but would start coming to Guam in the late 60s. And they would land on Guam and then they'd go right up to Saipan and start negotiating with the Trust Territory officials, the Congress of Micronesia. What is it that you want to be? What political status do you have? And the people of Guam looked like chumps. They said, what good was being loyal? We weren't rewarded for anything. We're not getting any high-level conversation. Nobody's paying attention to us. So the Guam legislature decided, well, we'll just create a process. So they passed Public Law 1217, the Political Status Commission, which basically didn't really do anything except they just wrote, and this was a Paul Bordallo idea. That guy was amazing. He did a lot in one term. So Paul Bordallo created this commission and they wrote articles about political status options. Then when they were going to give the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas They were going to give them super status. And remember that in 1968, the people of Guam were asked, do you want to reunite with the Northern Marianas? And the people of Guam said no, because they're way too poor and it will be a drag on our economy. And besides, a lot of them were collaborators with the Japanese. So now those people who were alleged collaborators with the Japanese are now all of a sudden getting high-level negotiations in order to create a commonwealth. There's just no fairness in this system. So a lot of people in Guam thought. And President Ford assured everybody that whatever the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas gets, Guam should get at least the same. That's the so-called secret offer. Well, that secret offer was so secret, nobody ever heard about it after President Ford. So that died with the administration of President Carter. So somebody had to do something with the territories, because the trust territory and there was going to create the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, something had to happen. So the Congress, US Congress, decided to assert its authority over this process. This process of political status negotiation was always seen as something that the president did, the executive branch did. So the Congress said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to offer the small territories a constitution. So they passed a law creating a constitutional convention. And so the next slide. So you had public law, US Public Law 94-584, and then they created the opportunity for Guam and the Virgin Islands to elect delegates and form a constitution. Guam formed a constitution and it was defeated. The Virgin Islands formed a constitution, and then they tried to form 4 more constitutions subsequent to that, and each one has been defeated. So this has not been a highly productive route for either of the small territories. But at the time, it looked like it was a possibility. So when the Guam Constitutional Convention was going on, the US State Department said, wow, this is great, because if the people of Guam pass the Guam Constitution, we can take Guam off the list of non-self-governing territories because they will be fully self-governing. This is great. This is a real opportunity. So the US State Department invited a UN delegation to come and observe the election of the Constitution in anticipation that the Constitution was going to pass. But of course, Tara Pada, myself, and a number of other people, and Tony Leon Guerrero and Marilyn Manabusan and a number of other people, we worked together and we defeated the Constitution, and by a 5-to-1 margin. So they weren't able to take Guam off the list of non-self-governing territories. That was the sub-story to that. But what happened was that we met, especially Tony Leon Guerrero and I, met the UN delegation for the first. We had several meetings with them. And there was a guy named Mr. Swai. He worked for the committee, the UN committee. And he explained to us the whole system. It was like a new world. What? We never heard of this. You mean there's a UN resolution 1541 to end, to a declaration to provide self-determination and independence to territories? We never heard of this. And we heard about the UN being on the list of non-self-governing territories. So Mr. Swai, we had was very instructive for us. Mr. Swai called Tony Leon Guerrero. Mr. Swai was from Tanzania. He called Tony Leon Guerrero Simba. And Mr. Swai called me Mwamba. And Simba in Swahili means lion. Of course, because Tony had a wraparound beard, and he was ferocious, and he was on. Mwamba meant rock. So Mr. Swai said, yeah, you're the intellectual foundation of this. So he called me Mwamba. So Mwamba and Simba, you know, learned a lot from Mr. Swai. That's why I put him in here. And we learned a lot about the UN Resolution 1541. Okay, so then next slide. Well, I went to the UN. That's what happened. So let's go visit Mr. Swai and his friends. So I went to the UN, obviously a much different person than I look today, but I went to the UN along with Chris Paris Howard and Ron Tehan. And by that time, we had organized I was the first petitioner to go to the UN in a way that was seen as adversarial to the United States government. And so a lot of people were predicting doom and gloom to me. If you go, you're never gonna amount to anything. The FBI will follow you around for the rest of your life and you're never gonna amount to anything. Your career will be ruined. Of course, 10 years later, I was elected to Congress. And then after that, you know, I also became president of the university. So apparently my career was not successfully ruined. But that was a very interesting time period. Next slide. So that's the Resolution 1541, reports of the principles which guide whether or not an obligation to transmit the international called for Article 73, and then to go over to the Declaration of Independence and Self-Determination. So by now, the term self-determination is in full use. And so that's the basis for that. And introducing that concept to Guam and CHamoru Self-Determination was, next slide, please. The creation of the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights. So we, in a sense, we found out about the UN process. We created OPR. There's a number of people involved in OPR. I hesitate to name all of them because then, you know, somebody will be left out and then they'll feel bad. But there were a lot of people involved, and Narissa was part of that too. And Hope Cristobal Ahmed, Chris Paris Howard, and Bernadita Dunca, Rosa Palomo, Marie Pablo, who went into the Carmelites later on, Phil Gutierrez, Clotilde Gu, just David Rosario, a number of people who were involved in this. And as a result of that, and as a result of the failure of the Constitution, the Guam Public Law PL 15-128 decided to create the Commission on Self-Determination. So now Guam has decided they're going to do something. This is novel. See, this is really, now we're going to create a process of self-determination. And so the governor will be largely in charge of the process. And the first meeting, one of the members was Richard Taitano from the legislature. And he asked the commission, who is the self in self-determination? And they all kind of like, well, I don't know, we don't know who. Well, if you don't know who the self is, then how can you exercise self-determination? Who's the self? Who are we talking about? Who was denied the right to self-determination? Who was conquered? Who historically and legally has a claim to this right to self-determination? And since they couldn't answer it, Richard Taitano said, until you answer it, I'm not coming back. And he never came back because they never really answered it. So then this process eventually led to the drafting of the Commonwealth Draft Act. Are we in the second break yet? No?
After this one, after this slide, we'll go into questions.
After this slide, okay. I just want to make sure we're, Yeah, go back to the previous slide, please. Okay, so the Commonwealth Draft Act was then the inevitable process, and they created a process where, you know, you had a whole series of choices. People went to vote, and then they had a runoff between the top two choices, and the top two choices were statehood and Commonwealth. Commonwealth won, and then they drafted an act called the Commonwealth Draft Act, and it had 12 articles and a whole other series of things created out of that, but ultimately was not successful either. So we'll end at this point, and we'll take some questions, and then we'll go to the final segment of this.
Okay, thank you. We do have some questions. I just want to announce or just remind the group that some of these questions there have been really great questions coming in. Some of them we'll save for the third segment of the conversation. But one of the questions that's come in that I think is very interesting is, can you share with us your thoughts on why U.S. citizenship was the major goal of Guam's political, I guess, our political leadership after the war, after World War II?
Well, it seemed, first of all, it seemed like a natural thing to deal with since it began before the war with B.J. Leon Guerrero, Tun B.J., and Tun Kiko Suilo had both gone before World War II as well. It seemed like they were convinced that if they were U.S. citizens, that they would not be treated in an arbitrary fashion. So that's why citizenship. And you know, it's hard to say because I don't want to create a different argument here, but it wasn't like we want to be American, quote American, and whatever that meant at the time, as much as we just want to be relieved of this kind of arbitrary treatment by local military officials. Interestingly, Samoa, American Samoa, had the same opportunity, but they came up with a totally different conclusion. The people of Guam were really suffering a lot from the land, the arbitrary land taking, and they concluded that if we were U.S. citizens, we wouldn't be treated so badly in terms of the land takings. In American Samoa, they said, we don't want to be U.S. citizens because if we became U.S. citizens, they're going to bring in land tenure from the states and our traditional land system will be destroyed. So they said, we don't want to be citizens, just keep us something else. And so they kept the so-called national status, which they have today, which is part of another lawsuit, which is winding its way around the court system as well. But the people of Guam and the people of American Samoa were both having land concerns, and they came to opposite decisions about what citizenship meant. So I don't know. In that sense, maybe the people in American Samoa were a little bit ahead of the game.
We'll see where that ends up too. But the other question that came in, I think this is really good. What would have happened, looking back, what do you think would have happened if the Guam Constitution, if the Constitution was passed?
We'd be off the non-self-governing list, and doesn't mean that the political status question would go away, but you'd have a different, I believe that you'd have a different quality to the government of Guam today, in which case people will say the issue of CHamoru Self-Determination is no longer a live issue because this has been a qualitatively different, not under the right of conquest. There's been some consent given by the people of Guam to the government that they have. So it's sort of interesting because the people of the Northern Marianas, and I don't want to create an argument where one doesn't exist, but Do the people of the Northern Marianas still have the right to self-determination? Do they have the indigenous right to self-determination? And some would say, no, they've already exercised it. They created the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. What, do they get another shot at it? Are they going to get another crack at it? You see, that issue. But of course, for Guam, they've never gotten that shot. So I think that issue would have been foreclosed. It'd be an open question as to whether or not you'd have better government. The Constitution as drafted was not an awful document. The delegates did give their best shot, but it was pretty easy to argue against because they had some arbitrary things in there that the opponents like myself could point to in debates.
Why would you say this is the process of self-determination is so reliant on the United Nations and its pronouncements?
Because the right of conquest, is, it's like, do you have the right to exercise arbitrary power over a people, over a dependent people? And the UN system has been to say that it doesn't. And the US sort of agrees to that, although they'll never say that they have colonies. They'll just say, well, we want them to be whatever they want to be, but it's not clear what they want to be. So that's why they're where they're at today. It's not a full-throated acknowledgement of the right to self-govern. And so that is the role of the UN in that. I don't think I'm under any illusion that this process is going to be resolved in New York at the UN, but it does offer an historical framework through which we look at it. Just like we look at unincorporated status from the insular cases, we go back to the Treaty of Paris, we go back to the right of conquest. We also look at the UN declaration, US declarations on non-self-governing territories and the right to independence.
Thank you. I have one more question before we can move into the next segment. With the Draft Commonwealth Act and I guess the voting on that act, would you say that's a decision that majority of the people of Guam did agree to, or I guess our exercising self-determination? Do you think that was a form of us selecting?
Well, the Commonwealth Draft Act actually sort of punted the question of CHamoru self-determination by saying within the Commonwealth Draft Act that in the future there will be some kind of activity or consultation with the native inhabitants. It implied that. So it was not an act of self-determination. I wouldn't have called it that. But again, that really speaks to the next section here, which is what is really, what is the difference between political progress and political status change, which is really the nub of the question.
Okay,
thank you.
We can move on into the next segment. There are several other questions that have come through that I think apply to this this part of your presentation, Senor Sizos Masi.
Right, so there we go. Thank you, Selina. So after the HR 100, which of course I introduced the Commonwealth Bill 3 times, and the third time I thought if I gave it the number 100, it would make a big deal difference, but it didn't. But it was what I was able to do was I was able to have a hearing in Washington, D.C. on the Commonwealth Act, which had never occurred before. They did have a hearing on it, a field hearing in Honolulu, but not a hearing in Washington, D.C. So I had about 20-some members of the committee attending, which I had to work on, which was a significant amount. And then you had 3 governors, including Governor Gutierrez at the time, and a number of legislative leaders were able to give testimony to it. And Congress was not going to pass that bill. they weren't going to pass the bill for a number of reasons, and we'll leave that to historians to interpret. Part of it had to do with not just whether Guam was ready, but would this process get in the way of what the Republicans wanted to do in Puerto Rico, which is to grant them statehood. So there's that issue. So in a sense, at that time in the 90s, the argument in Puerto Rico was statehood and what they call enhanced Commonwealth. So the Democratic Party were basically pushing enhanced Commonwealth, and the Republican Party was pushing statehood. This Commonwealth Act for Guam looked like enhanced Commonwealth to the Puerto Ricans. So it would actually get in the way of the agenda for statehood. But there were other issues as well. So the hearing happened, but they weren't going to move the legislation. So then the government of Guam created the Commission on Decolonization using UN definitions, and those are Public Law 23-147. And so basically the process now is clearly not about self-determination. Now we're just going to decolonize, and we're going to decolonize using the UN definitions. And those UN definitions is you become fully self-governing when you're integrated, a state, in free association, or a total independence. So those were the three options that were included in the government of Guam definition, legislation using UN definitions. And then later on, it created a Chamorro registry process. Who is going to vote in this? So they were going to create the Chamorro registry process. And this was modified a little bit after Rice versus Cayetano in Hawaii regarding the election of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Up until that time, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs was elected in the state of Hawaii, but only Native Hawaiians could vote for it. And they had a system in place in the state of Hawaii that allowed to do that. And the system was based on the honor system. And I always personally felt that was good enough. In other words, if you wanted to vote for OHA and you went in to vote on election day, you say, I want an OHA ballot. And then the election person there would say, are you a Native Hawaiian? And the person would say, yes. Then they give them the ballot. Now, that's it. It didn't have to, it was just based totally on the honor system, you know. And so I always asked the people who ran these elections with OHA, I said, did you ever get a lot of non-Hawaiians say they were Hawaiian? They say, yeah, a few, but most people just, you know, understood that that was the way it was supposed to work. And so they would not take the ballot. So you get some people who say, yeah, I'm Hawaiian in spirit, or, you know, I'm sympathetic, you know, eager to participate. But in general, up until that time, it was based on the honor system until Mr. Rice took the case. And after that, no more honor. You're not going to allow to use that. The elections were open to everybody. But of course, the difference between this, at least in some people's mind, the difference between this is that, of course, the full application of the Constitution applied in Hawaii because it is a state, whereas it doesn't fully apply in Guam because it is an unincorporated territory. So you could conceivably find a way to make that legally possible in Guam, except that Guam created the Chamorro registry process. And that Chamorro registry process became the basis for the Dave Davis case, which if they had followed the Hawaii model, they would have never created the registry process. So by creating the registry process, you now had an official list of who was Chamorro and who wasn't. And so when Dave Davis went to sign up for the list, they wouldn't let him. So then he had a case. Okay, next slide. So are we exercising our rights to self-determination, or are we exercising our rights as Americans? And this is a fundamental kind of a political point of view. This is the same kind of issue that confronted, in a way, the people at the time of the 1776, was that the English colonists, were they being denied their rights as Englishmen? Or were they just said, nah, forget it. We just want to be Americans. Forget it. We're not interested in being English anymore. So what is going on here? Is it in a way, is this like, are we seeking our perfection in the American system? Or are we completing a process of self-determination? And depending upon your point of view, of course, it's a competing point of view. Do the people want to be, in the language of the day, I want to be a first-class American. I'm tired of being a second-class American. Or do you want to exercise the right to determine the Chamorro people, to determine the political future of the no, I want to be a first-class American. Well, what does first-class mean? See, so that's, it's like at some point in time, you're trying to envision what exactly is your goal. So it is clear that under the current system, there is no consent of the governed. So the people of Guam live in a form of government where they do not consent to the form of government they have. They give no formal consent to the laws that are passed in Congress that apply to them, just like they apply to everyone else. There is a denial of the consent of the governed, which is the core of the American creed. So an argument can be easily made that Guam and other territories like it live under an un-American form of government, which is exactly what we live in. We live in technically an un-American form of government. There's no consent of the governed. So into this, you have the indigenous rights issue. So UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, kind of enters the scene in the 2000s, which, and this declaration is not really about, minority populations, minority indigenous populations who sort of live within a larger body politic. Like, you know, what are the rights of a small indigenous group of people like American Indians or Maoris or the Kanaka Maoli in the state of Hawaii. This sort of like says, this is what the UN feels about it. And so sometimes I think a lot of people sort of get confused. Are we pursuing this, or are we pursuing full-blown political status change under the name of the Chamorro people? Or are we just trying to be first-class American citizens? Just let me vote for president and I'll be happy. And then all bets are off, you know? So all of those really reflect competing views about where the island stands. So this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is yet another issue attached to it, but in a way it's connected to the original concept of the right of conquest, because they were conquering an indigenous people. But I go back to that right of conquest, because the right of conquest means that there's an obligation and a responsibility to undo that, even if you do it symbolically, or even if you do it for a half hour, or even if you just know what the end result will be. Okay, so we go to the next slide. We got to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Go to the next slide there. Now, I like to point this out. This is the picture on the wall in the Capitol. US Capitol, which was invaded a couple of weeks ago. So this is, you know, when you walk around the Capitol, you see these little sayings. The only legitimate right to govern is an express grant of power from the governed. That's the core of American democracy. So that doesn't exist in Guam because there's no grant of power from those who are governed, which is the people of Guam. There's no grant of power given to the Congress. Congress took it by right of conquest. And they may be like great people to hold on to it, and they may give us more money as a result of it, but in reality, they hold the power and they're not giving it back. And so that's and then the person who said this is William Henry Harrison. And the interesting thing about William Henry Harrison is he was president for a very short time because he got pneumonia and I think he died 1 or 2 months into office. So he wasn't I wasn't president for very long. But William Henry Harrison is the only president of the United States who started his political career as a territorial delegate. He was elected as a delegate to the US Congress from the Northwest Territories, which is now Ohio and Kentucky, parts of Kentucky, but that what they called the Northwest Territories. So William Henry Harrison, so I always tell people, there's hope for delegates. They can become president one day, but they can't become president if they're living in Guam. They have to go somewhere else. But that is kind of an interesting feature to this. So William Henry Harrison sort of personally understood the notion of this core American creed. This is the basis of representative democracy. And that's clearly absent in our case. Next slide. As I'm painfully aware, having been a non-voting delegate. So the question then is, can Guam trust the federal government? Are we, what the legal treatment of Guam is as a federal entity? It is, it's a federal entity created by Congress. And they certainly deal with our concerns as a political transaction rather than a relationship. That's the federal government. Almost every agency will ask you, do you want more money? What is it that you really want? If we give you this, will you just stop talking about this? Just give you a little bit more money and then you'll be happy. They want to move towards delisting. They want to proclaim self-governance by simply redefining what self-governance is. And then when you say, well, we're special, they say, no, you can't have any kind of exceptional treatment, is unconstitutional. And then, of course, if you make your claim against the, you make a claim either under the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, the United States historically now has become one of the handful of nations that is against all of these things, all of these special recognitions for people. So in an ironic way again, because the United States was the one of the chief architects of the UN system. Next slide. So I believe that the way out of this is it has to be done by the Biden administration. You can't let Congress do it because Congress will never do it. Congress will be subjected to a lot of different arguments, but the executive branch could do it. And I think that as the Biden administration deals with issues of racial injustice, this might be a good candidate for that, because there's a certain amount of issues that are attended to this and historical injustice. And so the Congress is never going to resolve this problem. If the executive branch negotiated an agreement and then presented it to Congress, then it has a chance of succeeding. if you have to negotiate with Congress or pass a bill inside Congress, it's not going to work. Recognize that one size does not fit all. All territories are different. Deal with the issue of self-determination. And the issue of political development is it must provide a third way or a clear route to statehood. So right now, the way the US system is designed is that statehood is the apex, it's the political apex. Everything else comes up short. Well, states can't do that. So therefore, until states can do that, you can't do it either. But in actuality, an unincorporated territory means that you're not really part of the country. So you can fashion something different. You could, I asked the question a lot, just as a kind of a theoretical question in almost every hearing related to political status. Is there anything that keeps free association and US citizenship from happening? And the respondents all said no. If Congress wanted to have free association for Guam and US citizenship, it could do it. Now, whether it wants to, whether the Puerto Rico issue will get in the way again. So I'm hoping that the Puerto Rican issue gets resolved, because that's a lot of people, and that's has a larger grasp on the consciousness of American society, as does the District of Columbia. So the District of Columbia and the Puerto Rican issues, political development issues, are clearly a part of our environment. Although we'd like to say they shouldn't be, but they are, if you really look at it. Next slide. So self-determination must be, I believe, must be the basis for a permanent political relationship. That incremental political development is not a substitute for self-determination, although it looks like it. Federal largesse, giving us large amount of money, is not a substitute for self-determination. I always like it when you start talking about self-determination, they say, don't bite the hand that feeds you. And that's really, when they say that, what they really mean is that you should just kowtow to federal authority because they're, and then I tell them, I'm not an animal. I don't eat at anybody's hand. We're not animals. So just the phrasing of that is very disturbing. And self-determination must be, as uniquely defined, must be supported by the administering power, which in this case is the United States. And administering power is UN speak for colonial powers. All right, next slide. I believe it's the last one, if I'm not mistaken. To Måmakpo, yes, to Måmakpo. It's not over until we say it's over. So Davis case is in the Ninth Circuit. This is not a prelude to revolution. I think it's a common sense solution to history. I don't think of it as the reversal of history. I think of it as the fulfillment of history. And you can't separate Tautotano. You can't say, we're gonna deal with this addresses the question about treating them like Indians, to separate them from their land. You can't do that. Guåhan and Tautotano to me are the same thing. And I think it's time for everybody in Guam's leadership to affirm its support in the same way that it did for self-determination in the 1980s and a decolonization process in the 1990s. And next slide. All right, then I'll give it back to Selina.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have several questions, and I think a couple of questions are related to the lack of movement. The question is, to what degree can we attribute the lack of movement on the part of the US government on resolving our self-determination efforts to the military's unfettered use and actions in the territory? And another question came in that was sort of similar, that asks, would you not agree that it was more of the Navy that played a greater role in keeping Guam and the Marianas only for strategic military means? So in these sorts of questions, you know, we're addressing the discussion of military influence or military power being hindrance to our exercising this right. So
well, I obviously it plays a great deal of great role in it. And, you know, if there were no military strategic issues, there would be no Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, because they wanted to make sure that they had a position from which to train. And that's what they're asserting now. Yeah, of course, the military is not a friend in this regard. It's not going to be friendly, because you're asserting, you're creating a risky situation for them. So they're going to be risk averse. On the other hand, I believe that if political leaders were a little bit more forward thinking in Guam's political leaders, they could use the fact of the strategic importance in order not just to get more funds, but to get a real conversation going on self-determination. And if they could do that, then of course, then the military role would become, instead of adversarial, could be a handmaiden to it. That sounds a little bit more hopeful than maybe it deserves, but you know, on the other hand, you know, you look at a place like American Samoa, which has almost no military strategic value, you know, except in some kind of wild contingency imagination. I don't know, but it doesn't change the dynamic much there either. At the end of the day, most of this is really going to depend on us, rather than looking for some far-sighted Secretary of Defense to come up. The Secretary of Defense and the admirals and the generals, they got lots of things on their minds. They don't want their minds and their desks cluttered with issues pertaining to CHamoru self-determination. They're hoping that somebody else can solve that problem so they can get on with their business. And so that's how they see it. So it's, and to what extent does their influence, it plays a big role in Congress, but in a new administration, where there are commitments to dealing with issues of historical injustice, where you're dealing with the first Native American Secretary of Interior, there's an opportunity to raise these issues, I believe, in a way that have not been raised before. And so that's the basis for, I think, some optimism. But they're not going to be raised by them just because they're interested in it. They have to be raised by us. They have to be raised by our own federal representative. And they have to be raised by the Guam legislature. They have to be raised by the governor. And we have to get them to raise them. And if they don't raise them, then there's no reason for anybody over in Washington, D.C. to pay attention.
This project, this what we call a civic project, some of the questions that have come through are, why this kind of project, these discussions, these conversations, why is it important for everyone to be concerned with? Chamorus, non-Chamorus, political leaders, you know, the common person. Why is this important for everyone to be concerned with?
Well, first of all, it's not going away. So this issue is not going away. It's an issue that, you know, when you think of justice issues and you think of denials and you think of fulfillment, these are the issues that come to, that are motivating. I think that a lot of young people today, there's more interest in this today than there was when I was younger. I think there's a lot more interest, and across the board, not just young Chamorro activists, but just kind of people who are intellectually aware, are coming to terms with it, trying to figure it out. You know, there's a tape there that was produced by a young Filipino American from Guam, you know, that helped produce that tape on CHamoru Self-Determination. There's all of this energy that's out there now. I don't believe that it should pit one group against another. And I don't think it's inherently divisive. But of course, politicians may want to use it that way. But it's not denying anybody anything that wasn't promised to them. I always find it curious that if I had lived in Wisconsin all my life, I would never get the opportunity to vote in an election of what Wisconsin should be. It's a state, that's it. There's no more conversation. But when I moved to Guam, all of a sudden, I should be given an opportunity to decide whether Guam should be an independent nation, a state, or free association. Why? Why should I have that right? I didn't have that right as an American living in the 50 states, but I get it when I come here. Why? Why should I have that right? And I don't think you should, because this is a qualitatively different set of circumstances. It's not meant to deny you the right to vote for somebody for governor or the legislature or to participate in the ordinary political discourse. But this is of monumental significance, and historically, I think it needs to be addressed. And so I think the more people think about it, you know, the Dave Davises of the world are fewer in number than the others. But of course, you know, I always take time to point out that Dave Davis really aroused a lot of people in a way that they sort of forgot about it. So in a way, Mr. Davis gave us an opportunity to re-engage.
Why does speaking of voting and Dave Davis, but why do you feel the electoral process should matter to me or to the other voters on Guam?
Well, because Guam is not fulfilled. See, it's just not, what is Guam? You know, I mean, when I was in high school, Tony Palomo was editor of Pacific Profile. And he wrote an editorial in there. And he said, it's a time to ask, what is Guam? That was the first time I thought about it. What is it? What is it for? What is its purpose? And who are we? Who do we think we are? And until we answer those questions, we're going to always live in kind of a temporary situation. So it should matter for all. It's not, you know, it's of course if it remains unattended, you know, look at the issues over the firing range. Look at the issues that we're going to have protests on next week. Those are real concrete issues. How did those issues get resolved if we really had self-government? I'm not sure that we would come to maybe a different decision. I'm hoping that we would come to a different decision, but at least you would have had a part in that decision. As it feels now, it feels like, you know, a decision is just made by somebody else and you're just stuck with it. And those issues are always kind of part of the picture. Even legislation that they're arguing now. They're arguing about legislation, and they will. They'll argue over relief legislation for COVID-19, because whatever legislation comes through, there's no real management or no real influence on the part of Guam and how that is going to work here. And so then we get all of these kind of disjunctures. And instead of like trying to figure out how do we navigate through the federal government, we start fighting amongst each other, amongst ourselves, blaming each other for being incompetent or corrupt, or, you know, it's very dispiriting.
Thank you so much. We're already coming to the end of our time, but there is one other question that I think is important, because you have been personally involved with these, with the movement and for Indigenous rights, CHamoru language preservation, and all of the work that you've done, and even a lot of the colleagues' names you've mentioned, you know, Hope Cristobal, all the other names of these people who've done this work before my time. The question that has come in is, what are some of the differences you can distinguish between what propelled initial CHamoru self-determination movements and what propels the movement today?
Well, I think there's more involvement today, and it's broader, has a broader framework. Could be deceptive because of social media, but it seems like more people are involved. I think at the time that we were involved in this, it seems so counter to the direction that Guam was going, that just going to the UN. You know, I didn't have a lot of money, so I had to ask people for money. Will you contribute so I can go to the UN? A lot of people gave me money. You know, give me $100 or $50, something. But they said, don't ever tell anybody I gave you money. So that's the main difference. I still have a list of those people, by the way. I'm going to out them one day. But they said, don't ever tell anybody that I gave you money to go to the UN. Because it felt very different. Today, it seems sort of natural, but it's still very much unfulfilling. I have a lot of confidence in younger, stronger, vibrant voices. There are so many opportunities for people to learn so many things today than there were in those days. If we didn't, if there was only a handful of us, if we didn't think it up, it wasn't thought about. And that was a sort of a lonely activity, you know, but we're a lot better off today. And so I thank all of you for making that possible.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up now. If I'm not mistaken, I think we've got a song, but Dr. Underwood, it's been a pleasure. It's rather, sometimes it does feel a little disheartening to talk about these issues. And, but we do have, you know, we do have a way forward. And Måmakpo manahajan astaki makpojan manajan todo no. And we are, you know, I'm hopeful. I'm personally hopeful and energized, and got to get our peers moving so that our children won't have these discussions about continuing the movement 20 years, 40 years from now. For as much as all the work that has been done that's come before my time, I just hope that we finally see an end, a victorious outcome, and something that we can look forward to in our future and my children's lifetime. So, danklu nasizos maasi para po.
Akumas, benhamzo todos. The Måmakpo. That's what my parents used to say before they yelled at me. The Måmakpo.
And thank you very much again to our panelists and our participants at today's webinar. If there's nothing else, I'd like to share we will be playing the song Nuebu Nashonta, sung and composed by Antiflora Baza Kwan. And this was a song recommended actually by Dr. Underwood. So if you will, please take some time with us to listen to her lyrics and this beautiful song. Sitos Maasi.
here to deny people a right. We're here to fix a wrong. They said it was over. Is it over? We're seeing something unprecedented in our island's history. We're putting aside our personal feelings about politics, our preference for a given political status, our differences in our place of birth, different languages, our differences in many ways, just to unite behind a single cause of CHamoru self-determination. We are the people of Guam who look out for each other, who respect each other, who understood that CHamoru hospitality and the half-a-day spirit was not an invitation to deny fundamental right to choose a political future. We are not dividers. We are uniters. We're not seeking to fight with others. We are promoting peace. That's why we are here arm in arm, step by step, marching, walking in the full view of our ancestors who came before us and are this moment watching us. Maila, come with us. Fanoki, Kahulu, Kalamtin. Move forward with one clear voice that will not be silenced, that will be heard here in Underwood, over there in the federal courts, in Washington, D.C., in New York, wherever there are people who make decisions about us. They must hear the echoes of history, the cries for justice, the voices of the people who are gathered here this beautiful morning. Let them know that you are here. Are you ready? Viva Guåhan! Viva Guåhan! Nalagang louder! Viva Guåhan!